But I was going to say, so you're our third guest. So Ed was obviously first, but today the episode dropped with Riz. And I was listening to it, and it is so good. I was thinking, how on earth are we going to rise to these heights again? So this is your task.
So
Should
no
you
pressure
accept
is what
it?
I'm hearing right now. Great.
You know, Ruth, we're in this like very delicate stage of growth. We're the little baby bird trying to leave the nest.
So if I annoy any of your listeners, they're just out for good. And
You're gonna
You
swat
won't
us
do
down.
that.
yeah,
you
maybe
know.
we should just wrap this up right now. And
And there we have it. Thank you for joining us on Modem Futura.
That was Ruth Wylie, and that was Modem Futura.
You know,
sometimes they're really short, folks.
you know what? You know, the YouTube Shorts is a less than 1 minute segment here, so we could literally just focus on that. But no, this is so fantastic, Ruth. You're one of my favorites. So thank you.
He says that
You tell that to all the guests, don't you, John?
No, well, I only mean it when I say it to you. Maybe it's. Yeah, this will be interesting too because, well, first of all, thank you for just the continuous flexibility to navigate around all of my recent health challenges. I'll do my best. Oh, they moved the button. Okay. All right. The mute button keeps moving, so I'm going to do my best if I start a coughing fit to, try to mute myself.
Like Riverside whack-a-mole.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's crazy. So interestingly, I kind of always do these little things. I'm like, how do we get our conversation rolling today? And one thing, so this is something, and Ruth, I know, we'll get into your, who you are and your role and stuff like that and learn a lot more about that. But knowing that you're someone who has often also spent a lot of time using visualizations and talking with people about futures and doing all kinds of fun, cool things. And Andrew, same with you in terms of, just again, going through different models and trying to describe things. So I was thinking about just this concept of visualization. And so I'm curious, just to kind of ask both of you, this idea of like, how easy is it for us to visualize the future or anything for that matter? So I guess our listeners can play along with this as well. So if I ask you to close your eyes, and people, if anyone's listening while they're driving, don't you dare close your eyes. You can do this with your eyes open. Unless you're in a Waymo. Like
I was going to say, unless you're in a Waymo, yes.
Then you're free to do that. Or if you're a passenger. But if you're driving, you don't do that. So, because, and let me back up one step here to say that when I was thinking about when we talk futures, especially like futures thinking, strategic foresight, a lot of the tools we use are often highly visual diagrams as a way of sense making, kind of putting complex ideas or showing relationships where they may not be obvious. And so often I find myself encountering people with a real difficulty to sort of visualize mentally these shapes and objects or models in sort of like their mind's eye. So I'm just curious. So if I ask you to envision in your mind a 15-foot tall bull African elephant with beautiful tusks, and those are those gigantic elephants with the huge ears, if you're trying to remember which ones the African elephants are. But the question is how detailed can you conjure this animal in your mind? Do you see like the detail of his muscles, the pebbled, dusty skin? Can you see the grooves in his tusks? Or do you see like a cartoon outline or nothing at all even? I'm curious. Let's start with Ruth. Let me start with you. How can you call this elephant and I will admit elephants are like my spirit animal if I were to have one.
That just ups the ante, Sean.
I have more to say about me than your question, but I go back and forth. So I and also might be primed by reading bedtime stories to my little one, but I go back and forth from like Babar, like this cartoon with no very little details,
okay,
to trying to think of a National Geographic magazine and thinking through it. But I think that the level of detail that I put in, one, I have no idea if it's right or not, because I don't have expertise when it comes to elephants. And I think those details that we fill in, my brain is happy to do it. My brain is happy to fill in these wrinkles and things. And I don't know if that's right. I don't even know really. You helped us by giving a nice description of an African elephant, but I don't even know if what I'm looking at in my brain is an African elephant. I want to Google it right now and be like, oh, okay. But I'm resisting
just
that
double
urge.
check that.
Yeah, I'm resisting that urge because I appreciate this exercise of imagination. But I think that those details that I fill in are based off my expertise or my lack thereof. And I would imagine that other people would have the same. But I'm curious, Andrew, what you see.
So this is so funny because my family had a very similar conversation a few weeks ago on WhatsApp, asking sort of, if you imagine an apple, what do you see?
Oh, yeah. I was going to say that an apple is the classic.
Right.
I went elephant because I was like, I love elephants and I wanted
But you can do it with all sorts of things.
Apples,
and it
stars.
turns out that people are different. Some people can actually visualize this thing, and other people can't. And the majority of my family said, well, I can think of the concept of the thing, but I can't necessarily see the thing. So I was the same when you mentioned the elephant. I can sort of imagine the concept of the tusks and the ears and the trunk, but it doesn't feel like a photograph in my mind. It just feels like a bundle of concepts and ideas, which the more you talk about it, the weirder it seems. That I have this amorphous concept of an elephant somewhere. And if you asked me to draw it, put it on paper, well, I couldn't because I can't draw. But if I could draw, I could probably fill in the details. But those aren't in my head.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's crazy because, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is because, one, it's just fun because, like, these are things, and I think, coming back to, we've touched on these items before around consciousness and things, and you can't tell like what's happening in someone else's mind without, and even things like color, right? We assume, I see the color red. I assume you see the same color red I do. But we know that's actually not really true. Right. And there's no way to really ever say that they're exactly the same, right? How I perceive the world, and if you just listen to the podcast that dropped today with Riz, it's all simulated. How do we even know? But it's so wild, and it's fascinating because you only have your own experience, right?
Right.
And so for me, I can and there's a spectrum. So the whole thing, I'm bearing the word here too. There's a term for this, which is if you can't envision these items like vividly in your mind, it's called aphantasia. Yeah.
Okay. Are you diagnosing us both now?
Well, it's not a real. I mean, it's not a real thing.
This is a therapy session, isn't it? Sure.
Well,
now I know I've got this condition.
It's sort of it's set up as an intervention for both of you.
Right.
We need to talk about this. No, but I mean, it was essentially this sort of study that kind of has its origins in like the late 1800s, but then was kind of brought back in like 2015. By a team at the University of Exeter, we're just kind of going over how people have these mental models and are able to, and realizing there is such a diverse spectrum, and it doesn't mean anything whether you have the high ability to envision these things or you can't at all. There's no cognitive implication to that at all. It's just you can or you can't, and things like that. But it is fascinating because you have these conversations and you're like, well, what do you mean you can't see the like for me, like this, whether it be an apple or this elephant, like I find myself on the far spectrum of it, like the hyper, whatever it would be, like the hypertasia or whatever the opposite is. Like I can see this thing and I can rotate it in my mind, and I'm like, yeah, this is. Now I still wouldn't be able to draw it, Andrew.
Right. But you feel as if you've got it.
I can examine it, and I'm like, oh yes, I know exactly what it would look like on the underside versus the the backside versus the tusk versus the but yeah, it's fascinating. And so for me, I've always found this interesting when I'm explaining especially using a common futures tool, like looking at like a cone of time or something, and I'm like, oh, it's like a cone and you just turn it this way and do this, and then people start looking at you like, what do you mean it's a cone?
So actually, but I've got to ask there, Ruth, you may have well done stuff in this area where you ask people to sort of draw what's in their imagination, and I can just imagine now. So now I'm envisioning this a group of people where you say, imagine a cone, and you get all these drawings, and some of these are wiggly things, some are sort of abstract sort of weirdnesses, and very few people will actually draw what you were thinking of when you said that.
So I thought you were going to go in a very different direction, which now I'm curious of, which is, so we can talk about imagining elephants and apples that we presumably all have experience with. But a lot of the work that we do also invites people to imagine different future scenarios, which we don't have experience with, right? I mean, we have some experience. And so this has really made me think, so if I go back to my thought about the way I imagine an elephant is based on my expertise or lack thereof. But what does that mean for how I imagine the future? And so a lot of times in the work that we do here at the Center for Science and Imagination, we invite professional concept artists to work with folks who are imagining futures and to draw images representing a future, whether it's somebody's personal future, like in our Veterans Imagination Project, or we do another project where we look at future cities and have people reflect on what are the values of those cities, what do the people think and feel and believe. But I go back to this level of when we ask people to imagine the future, I think it also comes back to their expertise around futures thinking, but also their lived experiences and how much they've been asked to exercise that muscle, to think about what the future is, how much it's based off of what they've lived through, what their experiences in terms of their own neighborhoods and cities, but other cultures and other experiences. And I think that a lot of times when we ask people to imagine the future, they rely on these experiences, like they close their eyes and they imagine the Jetsons, right? Because that is a vision of the future that we have been shown for a really long time.
And it keeps on repeating. When was the Jetsons shown? It was, 60s or something?
I remember, and this is where I'm going to hope somebody can fact check me on this, but I think that George Jetson's birthday was something like in July of 2023.
Okay.
Do y'all remember this? There was some, I think it was about last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, but it was, this was big in my circles. Folks were like, this is the date that George Jetson was, supposedly born. But yeah, that image that is quite old is still so prolific. And I think it's really interesting to explore why. And why hasn't that been replaced with something else? And, why is it still influencing what we're making? We're on a video platform right now. This is very Jetson-like. You're
going to mention flying cars at some point, I know.
Rosie, right?
Yeah.
Rosie, I also looked at, it was the first air date, Andrew, just was September 23rd, 1962. I couldn't find what George's.
Yep.
So here's also the thing I enjoy about the Jetsons too. I don't know if you've heard sort of like the fan theory that the Jetsons and the Flintstones actually take place at the same time. That it's like that split. It's that like Elysium, right? It's like the cavemen, the low level cave people are on the bottom, and the high society folks up.
What is it? The William Gibson quote that I can't remember exactly, but the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed.
That's right. That's exactly.
There you go.
That's it.
And I did just fact check myself. July 31st, 2022 is George Jetson's birthday. So
all right.
Entering the terrible twos there.
Let's we can all hope for the three of us, and we'll take a quick break here too, and then these cold opens are starting to become like the majority of the show,
right.
Which is hilarious.
It's a slightly warm opening at this point, I think.
It ain't cold. This is just we're doing that cool thing where we don't run the credits until we're a third into the show or whatever. So we'll take a quick break so we can get Ruth, we get your formal introduction there. But yeah, this is quite hilarious. And I think for the three of us, if George Jetson's too, we need to start thinking about how we make sure we end up in the cloud people and not the cave people.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, Andrew, welcome to another episode of Modem Futura.
Good to be here, Sean.
All right. And so as obviously now that we're probably like a quarter of the way through our episode, this is Modem Futura, the show that explores and examines and explores and examines, proposes, and even invents possible, probable, and preferable futures, asking deep questions like what it might mean to be human in the future. And today, if you can't tell already, we have invited one of our absolute favorite guests, Ruth Wylie, to join us today. And Ruth is the co-director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, where she is also the associate research professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. and a senior global futures scientist at the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. She pursues interdisciplinary, translational research projects that leverage knowledge and insights from theory and laboratory studies to answer real-world problems, especially in the areas of educational technology, futures thinking, and applied imagination. Ruth, thank you for being here formally.
Thanks for inviting me, and thrilled to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. We've had, as I think we were mentioning earlier, Ed has joined us, which was nice. So we've had
Ed being the other co-director.
Ed Finn
of
being the other
Science
co-director.
and
Thank you.
Yes.
But maybe you could tell us a little bit, Ruth, to tell us a little bit about, for those who aren't familiar with you. So for all the people who are about to become fans of you, tell us a little bit about what it is that you like specifically that you do there at CSI.
How long do we have? No.
As long as you want.
So I'm the co-director at Center for Science and Imagination, and our mission is about igniting the collective imagination for a better future. So we do that through a number of projects, and as you heard in the bio, they are almost all radically interdisciplinary. So we do things like bring science fiction authors and graphic artists and have them work with experts of all types, from researchers and engineers and all types of scientists, to think together and imagine the future. And not just imagine what the future might be, but to then start to think about what are the steps that we can start taking today to either realize those futures or avoid those futures if they aren't something that we want to work towards. And so we've done this through projects funded from folks like NASA and the National Science Foundation, and collaborations with folks at the Smithsonian Institutes, and then also smaller scale projects where working more on the individual level. So one of our colleagues, Bob Beard, has been leading the Veterans Imagination Projects, which is using these tools of futures thinking and foresights to help folks that are transitioning out of military service to imagine their personal futures. And then another initiative that I've been really excited to get going is about how do we bring more futures thinking into classrooms, and particularly middle school classrooms. So we know that companies have access to this. They hire futurists, they hire experts in foresight so that their companies can be more resilient and prepared for what's coming next. And so we've done that work and we continue to do that work, but we're also looking at how do we bring these skills to the individual level and help people prepare for and create the futures that they want.
Yeah, awesome. And Ruth, thank you. And, I have the luxury of have been able to have lots of conversations with you. We've even started a futurist community of practice with another one of our colleagues, Bea, who we'll be having on. And we need to do a separate episode just with that sort of trio. But one thing I think that is really exciting that I'd really like to talk about, if we can spend some good time today, is on that last piece around this idea of futures thinking in education, or I would even just say in youth, right? So in young people, and starting to have that, because there is this element, like you said, I mean, there's futures thinking, while still not even that well known, is much more prevalent at the, business and organizational levels. But usually the individuals who are doing that are mid-career, usually, right? Mid-career or even later.
And this is actually what really interests me here, because yes, and as you said, Sean, you've got futurists who actually have a position and a profession. But say you go into a 6th grade or an 8th grade class, I mean, they're not informing these sort of great sort of technology companies. So why sort of teach them about sort of being a futurist or the future or futures thinking?
Yeah, I think that because as we know, the future's for everyone, right? And it's a mindset. And I think that the more that we can introduce this mindset of encouraging young people to think about different scenarios that might happen, to be able to react to those, this idea that practicing futures thinking and foresight builds resilience. These are all things that are, while great for companies and can help stock prices, are also really critical for individuals. And I would say particularly for middle school folks. And I agree with you, Sean, that it's not just for schools. We have been trying to work in the more formal education environment, like middle school classrooms, because of our ability to reach a broad range of youth in those spaces. So there's also some great work that we can do in summer camps and other environments, but at least public middle schools are a great place that sort of encompass this broad range of young folks. And I think it's the idea that if we can develop what we're calling futures thinking agencies, so the feeling that not only they can imagine possible futures, but they have some agencies towards shaping those futures, then we can create a group of folks that are more resilient to the change that we know is coming. And so I think, again, it's about this mindset, preparing people to change their relationship with the future. So see it as not just something that's happening to them, but something that they can play some role in creating themselves. While also recognizing that there's always going to be some curveballs get thrown at folks, and that it isn't something that, the best planning, there's always going to be these surprises. But really, that's what I think futures thinking is about, is not just making a plan, but is about having broader visions, but being able to react to whatever comes your way.
Yeah. So I'm going to be the contrarian here, and I'm saying that because I love what you're doing. This is the space that I inhabit and I'm passionate about. But I can imagine somebody saying, "Why now?" There are a gazillion things that teachers need to sort of go through with their students, and a gazillion things that we expect our students to learn. Why add something else to the pile at this point?
That is a great question. And I think especially with the work that I've done, particularly with STEM teachers across Arizona, it is clear that we are asking more and more of our teachers every day. So a lot of the work that we're doing is not only about creating curriculum and creating activities that bring futures thinking to classrooms, but doing so in a way that also aligns with current classroom practice. So rather than trying to add in something else into the already incredibly busy school day or school year, it's about how do we take what teachers are already doing and add a flavor of futures thinking to that. But going back to your question, so that's kind of the how part, right? Like, how are we doing this? But the why is because, again, I identify as a scientist. I love STEM, and I think that learning those core reading, writing, and arithmetic is really essential. But it's also, we need to bring into young people more experiences with systems thinking, more experiences with these big questions. Because, again, getting at the goal of this podcast about what makes us human, I think what makes us human is the ability to tackle these really big challenges. And so if we can start to shape our school system to be one where young people get practice, where they can try and probably fail, but in a safe space, and try again, and tackle these concepts around big systems thinking areas like futures thinking and others, I think we're going to set this generation up for success in an ever-changing future.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's worth here also just taking a quick pause to just back up a little bit. And of course, I'll put the links to futures thinking documents and things like that, so resources, so people can take a deeper dive. But and you can get different, slightly different definitions, kind of depending on where you go. But essentially, just kind of to share broadly this framework of what futures thinking is, and maybe also quickly to touch on what it's not. Right. First of all, it's not predicting the future. Let's just put that aside, right? That's number one. What is futures thinking?
Forget about those flying cars.
That's right. What it is not is predicting the future. However, what it is a mindset, or you might even argue a philosophy, sort of that's based out of a broader academic discipline of futures studies in terms of where its sort of origins comes from. So think back to like the 1960s is really when this starts to really sort of pick up momentum. But is, I think, maybe most succinctly the act of evaluating different things that are happening, different trends, and then informing strategic plans to handle the future uncertainty that comes with any system. Maybe there's been another definition would just be kind of pinning it down to a strategic approach to envisioning multiple potential futures to inform present day decision making, exploring trends, identifying those uncertainties, and imagining alternative scenarios. So I think that's helpful to kind of outline what this is. And one of the things that I think is key, and this is something I talk about all the time when I talk about futures, and especially I used to do a little bit about becoming a citizen futurist, sort of breaking down this idea that you have to
like a citizen scientist.
Yeah, like
Yes.
there's you don't have to have a degree to
Right.
practice futures thinking, right? Like, and so I think, Andrew, kind of also to your point about why now, is, as we're seeing today, the speed and velocity that new technological disruptions and innovations are happening. I also feel like the necessity for building those mindsets and skill sets to handle increasing uncertainty is of highest importance. I mean, I think now the challenge, of course, and this is why I always say, that's why I kind of put that thing in there. It's not just education, because again, how many more things can you just put a responsible, a societal level responsibility on top of one professional group, right? And you have to, don't worry, you have to learn AI literacy now. So let's stack that. Now let's stack, whatever else. I mean, it's ridiculous. But I think that the pace of these societal, technological, environmental changes, that they're accelerating, and that futures thinking will give not only educators, but students the tools to navigate that deep-seated discomfort that comes with uncertainty. Like, what's going to happen if, fill in the blank, right?
Right. And Ruth, I'd be really interested to know how much this sort of fits into your thinking here, but certainly from my perspective, the rate of change in society that is being driven by technology is such that the world in 10 years' time from now is going to be radically different from the world we're in at the moment. So it actually, I'm now not going to be contrarian in my own world, but it seems
Andrew,
I can try, but it seems imperative that we need to be preparing the next generation for how to think in ways that help them navigate this transition. And you can't afford to start at the graduate level or the undergraduate level. You've got to instill this into the way that people think from as early on as possible. At least that's what I would argue, but I don't know whether that's what you're seeing, Ruth.
That I would agree. And I think echoing what's already been said here, that it is a mindset, it's a way of thinking, and it's a culture shift. And so the earlier we can introduce it, I think that's going to just be easier. Like you said, if we wait until we're teaching this to our graduate students, well, that might be too late. Not too late.
They're already locked into how they think.
Exactly. So if we can get folks that when they're younger and they're still learning how to think and they're still learning what to do, then I think we have a better shot at really getting this sustainable change.
Yeah.
And to echo also what Sean was saying, in addition to all those great assets, I think something that futures thinking allows us to bring into young people and everyone is this idea around empathy and social responsibility. So it's the ethics part too. It's not just what might the future be like, but in the work that we do. So we do this imagining, we do this creating, we use narrative, we use world building to imagine these possible futures. And that's great, and that's its own skill. But to me, the really important stuff is the facilitation and the conversation that happens after that creating. So I have a favorite activity, this timeline game called Futures by Chance, Futures by Choice, and groups of folks create these timelines over the next 50 years, some positive events, negative events, and then they reflect on, is this a future that they would want to inhabit? Is it one that they want to avoid? What are the steps? But importantly, we also say it's not just about a good future or a bad future, because that's not the question, but it's who is this future good for?
Right.
Who is privileged in this future? Who has power? Are we replicating existing power structures, or are we completely changing them? And we do this, though, in a way that's hopefully fun, engaging. At least the feedback we get, seems that people are enjoying it. But then we ask these pretty deep questions where it's like, oh, I haven't thought about that. And to me, that's the real success of these exercises. And that's when I get evidence that we're starting to change the way that people think. When we ask a question like that and they say, oh, I haven't ever thought about that before. And that's the shift that we want to see and that we're trying to get more young people to
Which
experience.
I love. And I just as you're saying that, it reminds me of what people are trying to do around sustainability and climate change for years, decades now, where you try and instill in young people a way of thinking about the world. And yet many of those efforts have got a slight dystopian tinge to them. I mean, the message seems to be, unless you're really serious about this and unless you take serious action, the world is going to fail. It's going to be an utter mess. So the burden of it is on your shoulders. But from the way you described it, this sort of approach to futures thinking, it seems to be liberating. And you're not telling children sort of the future is going to be awful unless you do something about it. You're saying this is your opportunity to flex your imagination and your futurist muscles and build the sort of, too many futures here.
I've got
build the sort of
muscles.
future that you would love to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I think that there is a place for the darker dystopia perspectives of the future.
Right.
But the work that we do at the Center for Science and Imagination, we really push people to think more about these more hopeful or optimistic futures. And part of that is because we feel the dystopian space has been well covered. So we want to push people to do the more hopeful thinking as a bit of a counterbalance. But it also, I think it can change that reaction, again, like you're saying, around developing that agency or that efficacy to, instead of trying to say, well, if we don't do this, everything's terrible, but to try to take those positive steps of, okay, we're going to get closer and closer to these futures that we want by taking these actions versus trying to avoid some terrible fate. That's a project that I want to get involved in more. You know, when I see positive changes and trying to avoid that dark side.
Yeah, it feels really exciting. I mean, the thought that you can be part of building an amazing future that actually sort of benefits those around you, but is the sort of future you want to live in, is quite incredible to me.
Yeah.
And something else that I think there's been amazing work with youth involvement in climate and that work. But one of the things that we've been working on, again, is trying to, if we bring it down to the individual level, it also starts to feel a little bit more manageable. Meaning that, you know, I don't know how to get all the plastic out of the oceans, right? But I can start to
Can't
look
even get
for
it out
ways.
of our drinking water.
Exactly. Exactly. But I can start to look for ways that I can make the future better for me, my family, my neighborhood, and starting to scale up.
Yeah.
And this idea that it is, when we get good solutions at the small scale level, that it's easier to scale to a bigger win than to try and tackle that big win from the beginning. And again, that's about building that mindset, that culture, and engaging a number of folks to create those futures that we want.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, because I mean, I was a child of the 80s when it was like, okay, kids, your task is to solve pollution. And it's like, okay, you know, and by the time you're 9, you're like, oh, well, that's not going to happen.
Sort of explains the bent back and
know,
the sort of
it's
aching
like,
body
come
from
on.
that burden.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, talk about like over leveling something, you know, he'd be like, here, children, solve recycling. I still remember, it was one of the kid magazines that the like the kid science school magazines used to get. Rick something. I was gonna drive me nuts. Anyway, and I remember this like image, and you open it up, and it was these kids walking. Turns out they were living subterranean in garbage bags. Like that was how they envisioned this. I just remember watching that or looking at that and just having this sinking feeling like, it's over. And just like tossing the magazine. Ricky Reader? Does that sound right? Something like that.
Sounds like it could be a thing.
I'll look it up in a minute when I get a chance.
You're hallucinating, Sean.
Well,
this is just proof that you're an AI on this podcast.
That's right. But I think that's important because, you know, futures thinking, and I have a list here too, if we want to, I don't know how detailed we want to get into things, but I mean, there's essentially some of these core principles, right, that we've talked about, most of them, in terms of, you know, embracing uncertainty, scenario planning, systems thinking, like understanding how these big things work together. But, you know, backcasting, right? How to, with those imagined futures of that I have agency in, is understanding how can I start taking proactive or steps towards these, desired futures or proactive steps away from undesirable futures, right?
Yep.
Not being, you don't start from the beginning and say, end pollution. That's, no one can make that leap. And if you can, well then, come on. But one of the things that for me that has always been one of the advantages of using these sort of tools is that it reduces future shock. Again, promoting hope rather than fear about those uncertainties.
Yep. Or possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I hadn't thought about this before when we're talking again about whether you're starting with the big end goal or starting with something closer. And my mind jumps to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And sort of
you're going to have to
explain
that.
Okay. It's like we need like a buzzer when anyone says like a big fancy term or it's like, explain, please.
Great. I love it. So Vygotsky's zone of proximal development is a learning theory that says that to create an optimal learning environment, you want to give your learner a task that is just beyond their current ability. So there, you can imagine, and I'm going to ask you to imagine a cone again. Here you go. Or
I can see an elephant.
I'm ready.
So Sean, you're going to follow this. Andrew, I'll draw you a picture at some point. But so you have these elements that are too close, meaning that the learner can do it very easily. They don't need any assistance. They can just do it. You're not going to learn if you keep only doing your fives timetables, right? You're not going to learn anything else. The other end is if you go too far out, right? So too far out, you give a fourth grader a calculus problem. They're just not going to be able to do it, right? But Vygotsky labeled this area that is just beyond their current ability, the zone of proximal development, which is something that the learner can do with a little bit of assistance. I think they call it from a more capable peer. And so it's with some practice, but it's that sweet spot that educators are constantly trying to hit. So again, you do something too easy, you're not going to see a lot of learning. You put something that's way too challenging, you're just going to lead to frustration. But that zone
it's the Goldilocks theory, in other words, the just right theory.
Yes. So it is the Vygotsky Goldilocks theory of education. You got to hit it right in the middle. And I am wondering, I'm sure there is, right? But what is that Goldilocks theory? What is that zone of proximal development for futures, right? And so what is it? Is it where if you ask people to think about what their and we can experiment with this from a number of different perspectives. So one can be time frames. And so if we do futures thinking for the next week, right? Well, like, okay, that maybe isn't too bad. I can imagine what tomorrow is going to look like. Again, might get shocked. Something might happen that I'm not expecting, but I feel pretty confident in that. You asked me to imagine what things will be like in 1,000 years. I don't know. That feels a little too far out. But it'd be interesting to play around with, and I'm sure some folks have. But what is that Goldilocks theory? What is that proximal development area for futures thinking, both in terms of how far out we want people to imagine, but also in terms of the reach of it. So not only the time duration, but the impact. So asking folks to, again, impact their own lives, their families' lives, their communities' lives versus these global problems. Global seems a little bit too big, right? But how do we break that down? But I hadn't played with that intersection before.
No, I
kind of fun to think about.
No, I really like that. But one of the things that strikes me with that is also thinking about the life experience that somebody's had. So obviously a 10-year-old child is going to have a different perspective of what 10 years means to somebody like us who are slightly older.
Yeah.
So I have this complete anecdotal theory that I don't have any data on, but I love to talk about, which is... Go for it. So again, we've done this timeline activity, futures by choice, futures by chance, dozens of times now, and globally. And we've done it mostly with adults, but we've created a version for middle school students. So we've done a number of sessions with young people. And we, in the activity, it invites people to imagine the next 50 years. And what I often see is that when working with adults, the in the activity you place future events that can really happen anytime in the next 50 years. Like they all seem probable, possible. And as a team, you decide when to put them on the timeline. Mm-hmm. And when doing this activity, what I've seen is that most people cluster all of the events in about the next 20 years.
Right.
So I have this idea that we can feel more confident about our imaginings in the future for about the same amount of time that we can remember back. And so,
interesting. Yes.
Again, don't know other than observing these from folks. But I would love to do some study with broader age ranges and to see, does this theory hold any water? But I think you're right that there is, our lived experiences definitely impact how confident we are about our future's thinking abilities.
Well, in Ruth, first of all, yes, let's do that. But also, I mean, to echo your point too, I mean, I feel like working with a lot of, doing a lot of futures work with a lot of professionals, for example, the time frame that also seems to work well is a little bit long, but like that 25 to 30 years is also nice because you can, I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but if you were to quantify a career length, right, of 30 years, a lot of people understand that because they can envision, like, think to themselves, what was it like when I first, especially if they're towards the end of their career, like maybe they're preparing for retirement or whatever, they can think backwards 30 years to when they first started. Like, how is the world around me today different than it was 30 years ago on my first day doing, whatever. And likewise too, when you have new professionals coming in, they are mixing with people who are kind of coming out in many ways too. So that 30-year time frame can be helpful, but going back to the other idea of like, why would you pick 1,000 years? Or even 1,000 years is a little squishy, which is fun. But even if you say like 100 or 200 years, so outside of the span of a normal human lifespan, or even outside of a couple, right? One of the things that so this is a really fun space to play in because it does a couple of things. So regardless of the age, and if they're younger, you probably don't have to go as far into the future because to a 10-year-old, 1 year is a 10th of their life. I mean, it feels incredibly long compared to me. I just celebrated a birthday and I'm like, well, that was fast. That one went by quick. And they just seem to go faster and faster and faster.
I know. Yeah.
But one of the real advantages about sort of kicking out far enough where you can break the experiential element is it creates a void, if you will, where there's a safe space to pull anything out onto the table. Yep. And for me, this is a thing that I think it would be really impactful and powerful in a K-12 or young educational mind sort of space, because it allows you to have conversations that you might not feel safe having about the things today because they're too close. Right. You don't have permission to talk about whatever it might be. But if you say in 300 years from now, what about this? Or how do we approach, thinking things about, taking any topic like gender fluidity or something like that in 700 years, you're going
to let the imagination go.
Oh yeah. Because it allows you to break the political, the cultural, the societal norms or constraints. And it allows you to just go, oh, yeah, let's talk about that.
But
then
here's
using that to kind of reel back.
Yeah, but here's the thing. In my experience, if you take somebody from about 20 years old and onwards, they are so locked in with their thinking that it's incredibly hard for them to let their imagination go wild and go free. But I'm wondering, Ruth, whether you see something different with younger children, whether they don't have the same constraints.
So I think that, again, part of this is, and going back to the why do we need this in schools or why do we need these experiences for youth more, is because I think we need to give them opportunities to practice this so that as they get older, they aren't as locked in.
Right.
That it's not a surprise that folks are locked in when they hit their 20s or so, because that is what we've been teaching them to do. Right. We've been teaching them to excel at standardized tests. And
think along rigid lines. Don't color outside the lines.
this should be expected, right? Like
Right.
that this is what we are reinforcing. Shouldn't be a surprise, but it often is. It's often a look and be like, well, why aren't we folks being more imaginative? Whereas you look in a kindergarten class and they're all being imaginative. And I think we are getting what we're training. And we are in many education environments, because really I believe of standardized tests, not because of any failure on teachers' part, but because of what we're asking teachers to do, which is to prepare our students, our young people to do well on these tests.
Yep.
They are being forced to teach along these rigid lines.
Yep. So I've got to bring something in there, which it actually occupies my mind a lot. And that is this idea that the rate of change in society is accelerating, largely driven by transformative technologies, but also sort of mixed in with a whole load of other things, including sort of social movements and social change, to the extent that I would argue very strongly that the world in 10 years' time is going to be looking nothing like the world of 10 years ago or even 20 or 30 years ago. And that tells me that if we're teaching to a world that existed in the past, we are not actually equipping our kids and our students to be able to thrive in the world as it's going to be.
I agree. And there are many folks that have made this observation before, that if you look at how factories have evolved in the last 100 years, radically, right? In terms of automation, in terms of technology, in terms of the roles that humans play in things like factories. But you look at how classrooms have evolved in 100 years, they still look pretty similar. Again, I am not the first one to make this point, right? But it's pretty similar. We have a group of students and usually one teacher. They're sitting at desks, they're learning. And so I think that is something to question. And there's some really great work happening here at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College about shaking things up. But it is one of those questions for us to ponder about where we are making these enormous advances and changes in certain areas, but education seems to be pretty slow to change. We're starting to see changes, as we all know, being here at ASU, in terms of how we educate in higher education, and those might percolate down. But it is something to think about, really, how little formal K-12 education has changed in recent or even sort of deep histories.
But it also strikes me, going back to some of the other stuff you were saying earlier about futures thinking, that you can almost see, and I correct me if I'm sort of misrepresenting this, but you can almost see sort of a mindset around thinking differently about the future as something that infuses everything we do at the moment in the classroom. So it's not the same as saying we need to completely cancel what we're doing at the moment with teaching and redesign it, but it's about infusing something new into it.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that that's also a more realistic approach. I think that education, there's often, I might argue, there's too much at stake to scrap it all and try again, right? We can't risk
we can't afford to lose a generation just through experimentation.
Exactly, right? But we also can't afford to not look for ways to innovate and change. And so by looking for these ways to bring in new ways to introduce system thinking, new ways to bring in resiliency and empathy, and I see this, futures thinking is a great pathway for this. We're able to hopefully get into a system, start to make changes that work towards broader changes, but without just scrapping everything and starting over.
Yeah.
That's
so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Sean, carry on. No,
Yeah.
I was going to say, so you both have young children.
Yep.
So I'm really interested to know, what are your hopes for your kids in school at the moment from this perspective?
Mine
Sean,
are older than, so we can take this as like, because Ruth formally started school, not yet, right? Just
my little one is 1 year.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's still like, yeah.
And what are you doing with futures thinking with your 1-year-old?
Yeah. So we're into it. We've got a third grader and a first grader now, and I will say it is. There are times, and both our children are well, it doesn't matter, I guess. But one of the things that I was just going to mention, that they go to a gifted school. So some things are different already from that perspective. But there are times where I am incredibly frustrated just with some of the rote methods that are still in practice, the worksheets, the thing, the same kind of things, which, I don't, again, same kind of thing, right? It's not, we don't need to scrap the entire system. But it is something that I do hope that we would start to see some of these questions and these sort of ideas of working these sort of mindsets into these things. Because I mean, even with kids, my kids' age, you start already hearing the tried and true things of like, when am I ever going to use this? Why do we have to learn this? School's no fun. And those are the kinds of things like, I'm like, it's your job. Just go, you soldier on.
It's not supposed to be fun.
It wasn't fun for daddy. It's not going to be fun for you. Like, but also trying to take that approach is from a parental perspective, of certainly doing these things. I play these games they're always sort of, under the guise of games that we play when, in the car rides, when we're going here, is I'll ask the kids, how do they think about stuff? Tell me about what you think this would be like in, 50 years, or when you're old enough to do this, what do you think will happen? Cause it's really, I mean, even just with, again, the easy tool to pick on is like generative AI stuff. But I mean, so, my oldest, there'd be a time where he would just run over on my phone, cause I have, Mid-Journey through Discord on my phone. He's like, let's make some AI images, and things like that, which is radically different, of course. But yeah, I would love to see my own kids going through this type of futures thinking process. And again, maybe not as a standalone thing, because again, that's a burden, but as more of like an infusion. So in the projects, in the units that we're already doing, would there be ways of building in some of those core elements, right? Just to continue to flex those futurist muscles, because again, I think the point here is we are the kids who are going to school today are going to be facing a reality that is moving and much faster and with much more uncertainty than what I dealt with when I first came out of school. And I think that's going to continue. So I think it is very important that people start paying more attention to these types of skill sets and mindsets to start baking into the normal curriculum that they have to deal with anyway, perhaps.
Yep.
To pick up on some of the things that Sean was saying, I do think it would be amiss if we put walls around futures thinking and it was, okay, third period is futures thinking class.
No, please.
Like that's not what we're looking for, right?
Yep.
Do not do that.
That is what we're trying to avoid.
Announcement. Do not do that.
It is about a integration, and that I also think is what makes it such a great area to explore. Again, it's not about just like, okay, stop doing your other things. Now we're going to do futures thinking, but it's about embedding that philosophy, that mindset into all the other subjects. So I want to echo that and make sure that that is that's stated for the record. But the other thing that I think is so great about these topics around asking people what, especially young people, what do you think this is going to be like, or what would be the implications of this, are that there's not an incorrect answer, right? And again, so much of our formal school system is about coming up with the correct answer. And so when we're thinking about how we're training and reinforcing our young people to come up with the answer that somebody else has already come up with, that can be hard, right? But if you now ask these open-ended questions and you say, what do you think? And then why do you think that? And get them to explain and see those connections. I think that can also engage a lot of, especially young people who maybe feel that school isn't for them, that feel like, oh, well, my grades aren't good, so I can't do this subject. But we can use these open-endedness of futures thinking to invite everyone to think about that. And we can't say that future is wrong, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen. And so I think that's another really great asset of including a lot of voices. And it also makes the one other point of this is that it makes the futures thinking that we do better. I think that futures thinking is strongest when it is done collaboratively, because we bring in these different experiences, because we bring in different expertise. And so by inviting the entire class or the entire scout troop or whatever it is to engage in these thoughts where there's not a right answer, then I think that we can help everyone to exercise that creative muscle and to develop that mindset.
One of the things I love about this is that this is so inclusive. We're not talking about something that is just for scientists or just for mathematicians or whatever. This is something that everybody at every part of the system, every part of the society, no matter what they're excited about, no matter how they think, can be part of. And the more people, the better we get at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's one of those things. It's like the call, maybe if nothing else, the call to action here, right, is to become a citizen futurist. But
you're going to resurrect this idea, Sean.
I love it.
I am, because it is something. It costs nothing to do. Yes. It requires no official licensing or certification to practice. But it also can be used, again, at the family level, at a organizational level, at like you said, it could be a scout, it could be a group, whatever. It could be a school, it could be a class, it could be, you can even use it just personally. Like, how do I navigate? Do you have anxieties about the futures? These are good ways of at least going, okay, it might be very helpful to kind of identify what are these things that I'm thinking about? What are these things that are presenting themselves as potentially either threats or challenges or opportunities? If this new thing happens, bang, then I could be ready to strike, and I'll feel confident that I've been doing essentially like, the work, if you will, of paying attention and kind of thinking about these things, so that when an opportunity comes, you're prepared. I mean, what's the there's no such thing as luck. It's just opportunity and preparedness or whatever. Right. And so like, if you want to have that, it's like,
you've got to be prepared.
You have to be prepared.
Yep.
And, and I think, Andrew, you and I have had this conversation, I think for a long time. It's an ongoing one, but I think the power that will come of the next generation of professionals who leave school will be those ones who have these types of skill sets and mindsets ingrained in their own identity.
I agree.
So they might not even know it, right? Like, I am a futurist. They won't have that. Because we can all agree that might be obnoxious if everyone runs around.
But they think in a futurist way. They can
way.
understand the world, and they can make sense of it, and they can chart pathways forward in ways that they couldn't otherwise do.
Absolutely. And regardless of what sort of career path they take into arts or in banking or in local or national government or higher education, whatever, that they're bringing that same skill set, being mindful about those uncertainties and how to think about what happens. If this happens, then what? How do we handle these things that we're becoming aware of, and making a much more proactive stance as opposed to a reactionary one, which usually is, very slow and often filled with challenges.
Yeah. And I would put a really sharp point on this. And if you think of how the world is going to change over the next 10 to 30 years, artificial intelligence is going to turn upside down pretty much every aspect of society and every sort of job we do, every sort of way we create value. Advances in biology, radically changing how we think about everything from disease treatment and prevention to how we even modify ourselves. You look at spaceflight, and there's a reasonable possibility that in the next 20 years, we're going to be sending people to Mars. The world is changing in fundamental ways. And it seems like if people aren't prepared to embrace that and learn how to navigate it in, I would actually say, joyful ways, as well as avoiding the potential challenges, I'm not quite sure how we're going to thrive as a species.
Yeah.
It's a dead silence.
You killed it.
Did you say you're not sure how we're going to thrive as a species with all these?
I did. I said I'm not quite sure how we're going to thrive if we don't have a different mindset in terms of how we learn and think about navigating this radically different future. Yes.
Yes. I mean, you're probably preaching to the choir here, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That I think that we need these new mindsets. We need these new approaches in order to react and create futures that we want, that are more equitable, that have balance of power, that to achieve that goal of, I think, how we agree what it means to thrive as a species.
Yes.
And I think that's another, probably a topic for a whole other podcast. But I think that it's interesting that we will, as I mentioned earlier, in all these different future scenarios, it's not a good future or a bad future. It is relative to different types of people. And that's something that we often really push people to think about is, again, who are the winners? Who has privilege? Who has power? And I think that when we're reflecting on this world that is changing faster than ever, to think about, are we giving power to the folks that have the power now? Are we doing a better job at distributing that? How is this impacting folks not only in certain neighborhoods and countries, but around the world? And so I think that, again, not to keep beating on this drum, but this is one of the values.
Sorry, we're making good rhythm. That's cool.
Yeah, is that it explores these topics of systems change. It allows folks to look at topics and different patterns, to come at it from an applied perspective, as a problem-solving perspective, and again, probably obvious that I agree with you, Andrew, but it's like these are the mindsets that we need to be instilling in order to create at least the future that I hope that we inhabit in the next 10 to 30 years.
And from as early as possible. You can't just make it a graduate class. It's got to start from, I was going to say year dot, maybe a little after that, but pretty soon after that.
Once object permanence is established, know. Well, and I would just kind of cap on there, and then we can think about trying to wrap up our conversation here too, because I know, Ruth, we've already held you here for, looks like, I'm looking at my calendar.
Imagining a future where this podcast comes to an end.
I hope that's that 30-year time frame, pal.
I was actually thinking about this episode, but yes, you took it there.
I can't laugh too hard. You're going to trigger a coughing bout here. But to see that, for me, again, this kind of this idea too, right, is something I keep circling back to, is this question or this idea around who owns the future. And I think that's a question that's intentional to start really thinking about that, how you would answer that in as many ways as you could come up with, right? But all the way down to even just generational. If you think about, my ownership of the future is far less in terms of the number of years than it is my own kids, and things like that. And so we're often saying it's for the future. It's for the kids. We're doing this for the kids. They're the next generation. We're making it, better. Well, that could be, I guess, debated as making it better or worse for the next generation. But we say this all the time, and yet we very seldom go ask those kids who it is their future we're gambling, that we're playing with, that we're creating systems around, but we never usually get their voice. And I think that's one of the things that would be that I want to see change, that I want to see us proactively seeking the input of the youth, and in giving them these tools like futures thinking as one of many ways of starting to exercise their own abilities to start to question, think, and create the futures they want. Instead of being, because we do this all the time. We talk about futures and then we go talk to people our own age about, Andrew, what do you think of the future is? Ruth, what do you think the future is? And it's like, we forgot to ask the kid who's 9 years old, who is like, well, I want the future to be this, right? And so that's one thing that I really hope starts to change. And I mean, that's another one of the many reasons we started a podcast like Bodum Future, is to give these conversations to everyone, instead of just putting this down in like an academic journal or somewhere where 12 people will read it. But yeah,
an optimist.
Well, there's 11 other people I could email to read it. Right. But that's the hope, is that we really start to engage with the youth to empower them around this idea of futures. And for people who are at those current sort of middle or late career stages who have the disproportionate amount of influence and power, given just their age to like the youth, to be open and listening to these as well. And not just, I know better because I've reached this stage in my career. Yep. So that'd be my hope.
Well, it sounds like you've also now outlined your future podcast guests of getting some young people invited behind the mic here, which I can't wait to hear those episodes because I think you're right. I think that it's when you first pose the question of who owns the future, I almost had a visceral like, oh, that's a terrible metaphor, right? Like, because it suggests that other folks, that there is owners and not. Yeah. And then when you presented it as, sort of this idea that young people really should be the owners because they have more there. It is an interesting perspective, and I think you're right. And it goes back to these issues of power. So if it is the young people that quote unquote own the future, but they don't have the power to make those decisions. And again, there's some amazing examples of young people, particularly around climate, like Andrew mentioned before, of creating the power and creating the voice and really making great changes. But those are exceptions rather than the norm. And how do we get this into more of a mindset and more of a culture? And maybe I'll end with an example. We did a futures thinking exercise with the Smithsonian a couple years ago around their big futures exhibit. And we worked with a number of the different museums and research institutes. So cool. And one of them was the National Museum of American History. And we brought in experts from the museum and a science fiction author and a graphic artist, and we had them do world building. And the conversation that emerged from the one with the National Museum of American History was about kids voting and what happens if kids got the right to vote. And, maybe they start with just being able to vote in local elections to figure out how should money be spent to improve the playground at their local park. And then as they got older, they started to be able to weigh in on council members, for example. But this idea that, again, like a mindset, that right now we say to anyone under 18, you can't vote. And then we expect people to, at 18, all of a sudden become engaged in our electoral process. Mm-hmm. That if we started this from a younger age and it was a culture thing, every year you went to vote, why would you not? Then we might also be able to see some give power to younger voices, but also to create a change that, again, is part of a future that I hope for, which is a more engaged civic system. But so just an interesting example of how do we start to shift some of those conversations and those mindsets.
Fantastic. Well, I think this is a great place to kind of end this. Ruth, you brought us all the way. You landed the plane. So nothing like inviting another pilot onto the aircraft and having them land it. So I much appreciate it.
So
That's
fun.
Wonderful.
This is great.
Yeah. But Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute blast to have you with us on Modem Futura. So I hope you'll come back.
Yes,
I will, especially if we can get some young folks here.
I know. Yes. Yes. Stay tuned for this. We're going to have to do this.
Yeah. And I'll foreshadow a little bit. I have one of my own young people who has been desperate to come on. So we're going to work on making that happen as well. We'll be sure to drop anything. And Ruth, drop me a line if you have anything specific you want me to put in the show notes. Sure. Otherwise, I'll just link the projects normally from CSI in there. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us again today and helping run this show.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you again, Ruth. This has been fantastic.
Well, great to chat with both of you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So from all of us, thank you for staying with us for this fantastic episode of Modem Futura, and we'll see you on the next one.